Professor Des Gorman from Auckland University School of Medicine joins me now. Kia ora, thank you for your time this morning.
How are you?
Oh, really well, how are you? Good?
Good.
Yeah, well, so let's ask the question, is an 8-week shutdown with Australia warranted?
Look, it's understandable because we're not vaccinated, and so as a result we're particularly vulnerable. We've struggled throughout to get contact tracing to the level that we need it to be. We tend to have surges of interest in being tested and then they die away. So confronted with our lack of vaccination, then an 8-week lockdown is probably the only response that was available to the government.
But there is some concern, or maybe some surprise here, that for the next week, Kiwis that are in Australia can come home from 6 states and territories, not New South Wales, but other states and territories, without even self-isolating. Is that a risk?
Yeah, it is, and it's inconsistent. And one of the problems we've had throughout the management of this pandemic has been behaviour in terms of responses which have been up and down in terms of acceptable risk. Now, I could understand the next week allowing people who have been vaccinated to come home if they've had a negative pre-departure test, but this next week, come home now, is really taking a punt.
It's taking a punt. But are they saying that and not allowing, and saying you don't have to self-isolate just purely because we just don't have the MIQ facilities? In
part, but also I think it's trying to manage the optics. One of the problems with a politicisation of any health response is that it's hard enough managing the health risk and the economic risk, but when you have electoral risk as well, it's very, very difficult. And we've seen politicians all around the world struggle to get that balance right. So it's a matter of what's the right thing to do versus what's the thing the public would like to see me doing or which they're most comfortable with me doing. Well,
that seems to be playing out in Australia at the moment because we've had Scott Morrison apologising this week for Australia's slow vaccine rollout. New Zealand's measurements are basically the same, aren't they?
Yeah, well, even slightly worse.
Even slightly worse. So should Jacinda Ardern be doing the same thing?
Oh, I'm not interested in hearing the Prime Minister apologise for it. No. What I want to hear is a plan about how we go from isolation to integration. I'm not really interested in saying I'm so sorry for how slowly it's going. We all know that. But tell us how it's going to be accelerated. Tell us how we go from this hermit colony to being part of the world again. Let's hear what the integration sounds like.
OK, well, we've got an experiment happening right now, in 2 places right now around the world. First of all, Britain is gone from the hermit colony now to just Freedom Day. How do you think that's going?
Look, I think
they've got high levels of vaccination.
Yeah, well, 2/3.
2/3.
And 2/3 of most of that's AstraZeneca. So, look, I think what's happened there is because you have a growing expectation amongst the public of being allowed out one day, you get to a certain level of vaccination and suddenly the desire to be let loose just becomes overwhelming. And you go from nothing to everything. I think it's early, I think it's precipitous, I think it's probably dangerous, but I understand why it became a political necessity. And the issue for us is how do we step change ourselves so we don't end up in that same point where later this year, when 2/3 of us are vaccinated, the government doesn't come under huge pressure to just open the gates. In the same way you mentioned about allowing people in for the next 7 days, that's a pragmatic political response, not a health-related response.
So are you concerned that, at the end of this year, we're all just going to want to head off into the world and let the world in?
Absolutely. I think there's going to come a point where that desire to go back to life as normal becomes so overwhelming that it'll be almost unmanageable. And we're seeing that in Sydney now, Simon. If you look at, the Premier gets up, says there's 100 new cases, of which 40 to 50 were wandering around the community. Yeah. So clearly when she said go home, stay home, a lot of Australians said no thank you.
Yeah. OK, so you say, how do we nuance this? How do you manage it?
Well, I think there are a number of things we need to do. The first thing is we need to understand what liberty vaccination brings and what we allow vaccinated people to do because of the fact they're vaccinated.
So you're saying people who are vaccinated have more freedom?
Absolutely.
That's
because if you
line.
think, people who are vaccinated are less likely to get the disease. If they get it, they're less likely to be sick, they're less likely to transmit it, and they're less likely to mutate it. But I think we also have got to the point, and this is true for most countries around the world, where we need to start shifting the way we govern and manage the pandemic. If you think about the way in which we govern ACC, the super fund, it's at arm's length from politics. It's an expert governance group. The government makes it clear to that group what its expectations are, but then gets out of the way of people who actually are expert at governance.
You want to take the politics out of public health management, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, OK. But in insisting on that people who are vaccinated have more freedoms, are you creating 2 classes of citizen here?
Yeah, we are. There are 2 classes.
And there's no apologies for that?
No, you're vaccinated and you're unvaccinated. I mean, it's just a simple biological reality. Right. One's risks here, one's risk here. That's just simple. That's simple biology.
And the politicians are going to have to wear the political pushback on that, aren't they?
Well, they are, because they're going to have to do it at some stage. at some stage they're going to have to deal with an expectant community saying, give us back our freedoms, we've done our bit, we're all, 2/3 of us are vaccinated, we're heading off into the wild blue yonder.
So until you get an acceptance that, you know, you have freedom if you're vaccinated and not if you aren't, we've got not only Britain doing an experiment at the moment, but we've got the Olympics carrying on at the moment. And that's all of the world coming together with different COVID policies. Is that going to work?
Well, you'd have to guess that there's going to be outbreaks, there's going to be little mini crises, there'll be some events, which, particularly team sports, which will default. I think it's going to be, it's fascinating natural experiment, but I think it's got risk written all over it.
OK. Professor Des Gorman, thank you very much for your time this morning.
You're welcome.